The chandelier hummed softly above the dining room, its golden light spilling over white tablecloths and polished silver as the murmur of Christmas conversation swelled and faded like the tide. At the Harrington table, a red plate sat untouched in front of a little girl in a matching red dress, her small jaw clenched, fingers tapping an angry rhythm on the linen. James Harrington leaned in, voice low but edged in steel, his famous smile stiff at the corners as he warned his daughter not to start again, not tonight, not in public. Across the room, waiters slowed without meaning to, sensing the storm gathering at the center of the luxury they served. Camilla, balancing a tray of empty glasses against her hip, watched as the girl's hand shifted toward the plate, eyes blazing with a hurt that looked far too old for 10. The plate scraped sharply against the porcelain, a harsh sound that cut straight through the carols playing in the background. Olivia's chair jerked back, her small body coiling with the wild determination of someone who had discovered destruction was the only language adults didn't ignore. James's hand shot forward, fist tightening above the table, not to strike her, but to slam down in frustrated command, to force obedience the way he forced deals into place. A nearby couple fell silent mid-laugh, their smiles hanging helplessly between politeness and discomfort, while a toddler at another table stared with wide, uncertain eyes. The manager, already sweating in his festive tie, began to cross the room, rehearsing apologies in his head. The moment hovered, fragile and bright, like a glass ornament about to fall. Camilla moved before she finished deciding to move, her worn black shoes whispering over the carpet as she left the safety of the service station. The tray trembled slightly in her hand, glasses chiming nervously against one another as she set it down on a side table without looking, eyes locked on the girl's trembling shoulders. She had seen tempers before, grown men snapping at staff over overcooked steaks and lukewarm wine, but this felt different, raw, like grief trapped inside a body too small to hold it. Olivia's fingers curled around the edge of the plate, ready to send porcelain and food crashing to the floor in a single, explosive plea for attention. For a heartbeat, Camilla glimpsed her younger self in that expression, a child who had once thrown a cup across a tiny kitchen just to make her overstretched mother finally turn around. She stepped between father and daughter with a quiet, steadying breath, the red of her uniform catching the same golden light as the girl's dress. One hand went up, not in a grand theatrical gesture, but in a simple barrier, palm open in the universal sign that means stop. Please, just stop. The chandelier light haloed the three of them in a sudden, trembling stillness, crystal stems and silver knives glinting like witnesses around them. James froze, his fist suspended mid-air above the table, shock flickering in his eyes at the audacity of a waitress inserting herself into the private battlefield of his Christmas performance. Olivia stared at Camilla, her anger colliding with something quieter, something like surprise at being stood in front of instead of against. "Enough," Camilla said, her voice low but clear, each word sliding through the heavy silence like a small, deliberate stone across still water. "Not tonight, not on Christmas." The carols continued to play, but the restaurant itself seemed to hold its breath. Conversations died mid-sentence, forks hovered inches from mouths, even the candles on the tables looked suddenly too bright. Heat rushed to Camilla's face as she felt dozens of eyes anchoring her to the spot, measuring her, waiting to see whether this was bravery or foolishness. In the space between those words, and whatever would come next, she became painfully aware that she had just done the one thing everyone in that room feared most. She had told the truth in a place built on careful, glittering lies. For a heartbeat after Camilla's words, nothing moved. The restaurant seemed to fold in on itself, all sound sucked into the glittering chandelier above them. A fork clinked somewhere in the distance, the tiny metallic note ringing out far too loud in the sudden hush. James's fist slowly relaxed, but his hand stayed on the table as if he were anchoring himself to the white linen. Olivia's fingers slipped from the plate, her shoulders heaving with small, shallow breaths, eyes locked on the waitress who had dared to step into the line of fire. Around them, conversations died mid-sentence, leaving only the hum of the air conditioner and the soft crackle of candlewicks struggling for relevance. The manager arrived at James's elbow with the strained smile of a man already writing an apology email in his head. "Is everything all right, Mr. Harrington?" he asked, though the answer hung plainly in the air between the toppled cutlery and the girl's swollen eyes. James did not look at him. He looked at Camilla instead, studying her face as if trying to place where exactly she had come from and how she had been allowed this close. His public persona fought to reassemble itself, the corners of his mouth twitching toward a controlled smile that never quite arrived. Somewhere near the bar, an ice cube cracked inside a glass, the sharp sound making Camilla flinch as if it were a gunshot. Camilla felt the weight of her raised hand and lowered it slowly, fingers tingling with the realization of what she had just done. Heat crawled up her neck under the stiff collar of her uniform, while the scent of roasted meat and cinnamon sugar turned suddenly cloying, thick in her throat. She became acutely aware of every detail. The crease in James's expensive shirt, the tiny scuff on Olivia's patent leather shoe, the smear of sauce on the edge of the plate that hadn't yet fallen. Her mind raced ahead to rent due dates, to her manager's warnings, to the memory of a previous co-worker who had disappeared from the schedule after one misunderstanding with a wealthy guest. Yet under the terror sat something stubborn and quiet, a belief that if no one ever said enough, this child might never learn what safety felt like. Olivia's gaze flickered from her father to Camilla and back again, mistrust wrestling with a flicker of raw, unguarded curiosity. No one had stepped between her and an adult's anger before. Usually they stepped away, leaving her alone in the center of her own explosion. Her lips trembled as if she were about to shout again, but the words seemed to wither before reaching her tongue, leaving only a hoarse little breath that sounded a lot like a swallowed sob. The red bow in her hair had slipped crooked, the once perfect ribbon now a little askew, like the carefully constructed image of the Harrington family. Under the table, her foot tapped erratically against the chair leg, a nervous rhythm that only Camilla seemed to hear. "Miss," James finally said, his voice low and careful, as if each syllable cost him more than his most expensive donation. "We will discuss this outside." The manager seized on the sentence like a lifeline, nodding eagerly and gesturing toward the staff corridor with a hand that shook despite his efforts to appear composed. Guests began to mumble again, pretending to return to their own meals, but their eyes remained fixed on the trio at the center of the room. Camilla swallowed, feeling her world narrow to the path that led away from the table and toward whatever consequences waited for her beyond the swinging kitchen door, wondering if, in choosing to protect a stranger's child, she had just quietly signed away the little life she was barely managing to hold together. The alarm on Camilla's phone had gone off in the dark, long before the city's Christmas lights blinked awake, its harsh buzz echoing around the little basement apartment. She lay still for a moment, wrapped in a thin blanket, tracing the cracks on the ceiling, and listening to the pipes rattle as another tenant started their shower. The air smelled faintly of frying oil from the diner downstairs, and of yesterday's cheap coffee still sitting cold in the chipped mug on her nightstand. She reached for the mug that said "College Dreams," the letters half faded, and tipped it over on the mattress, letting a small rain of crumpled bills and coins spill into her palm. Her fingers moved automatically, counting what was there and what was missing, the numbers forming a tight knot in her chest. The apartment was more hallway than home, a narrow strip of space lined with things other people had thrown away before they became her treasures. A sagging couch doubled as her bed, its springs poking insistently at her ribs, while a tiny table bowed under the weight of textbooks bought second-hand and paid in installments. In the corner, stuck to the wall with clear tape, a photo of her mother smiled from a different world. Sunlight, laundry fluttering on a line, a blue sky too bright to be believed in winter. Beneath the photo hung a single plastic branch with 3 red ornaments, her attempt at a Christmas tree, purchased from a discount bin and carried home like something fragile and priceless. She straightened one of the ornaments, whispering a promise to herself that next year, maybe, there would be more. Her phone lit up with a missed call and a voice message from her mother, sent hours earlier from another time zone. Camilla pressed play and listened to the familiar voice fill the small room, warm and hopeful, asking if she was eating well, if work was steady, if the snow in America looked like in the movies. Her mother spoke as though her daughter lived in one of those movies, big coat, big dreams, big chances, and Camilla didn't have the courage to describe the damp walls or the way her feet never stopped hurting. She answered with a text instead, fingers flying over the cracked screen, painting a picture of safety and progress she hoped might one day be true. Before putting the phone away, she hesitated, then searched for bus tickets home, closing the page quickly when the price made her stomach twist. In the tiny bathroom, she splashed water on her face, the tap complaining in rusty groans, and stared at her reflection in the spotted mirror. The girl looking back at her was younger than her exhaustion suggested. Dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail, eyes rimmed with the faint shadows of too many late shifts. She tied the red ribbon around her wrist, a leftover from last Christmas at the restaurant when someone had tossed the decorations into a box, and she had quietly pocketed this one. To her, it was a reminder that even discarded bits of beauty could be claimed, could become part of a different story. She pulled on her black shoes, feeling the worn insoles fold under her heels like old paper, and told herself that one more holiday shift meant one more month closer to the degree that might change everything. Snow slushed beneath the bus tires as she rode across the waking city, forehead resting against the cold window, watching strings of lights shiver in the wind above storefronts. She mentally sorted her night into tips and hours, rent and tuition, balancing columns in her mind the way other people balanced decorative napkins. When she finally stepped off at the corner near the restaurant, the building rose ahead of her in glass and stone, glowing warmly against the grey afternoon like something pulled from a magazine. Inside, the marble floors and polished brass reflected her in 100 versions, each one in the same red shirt and black apron, each one a little smaller than the last. As she slipped through the staff entrance, shaking snow from her sleeves, the manager intercepted her with a clipboard and a nervous smile, and casually mentioned a last-minute change. Tonight, she would be in charge of our very special guests, the Harrington family, a name that made other waiters look up sharply, while a chill slid down her spine, warning that this table would not be like the others. By the time the early seating began, the restaurant had transformed into a snow globe of controlled perfection, every table set like a tiny stage in red and gold. Camilla moved through the dining room with practiced grace, checking candles and straightening cutlery, trying to ignore the way the word Harrington echoed in her head. She'd heard the stories in the staff room about the billionaire whose holiday galas fed entire neighborhoods, whose smiling face appeared in charity brochures and business magazines alike. To the city, James Harrington was a symbol of generosity and success. To the restaurant, he was the client no one could afford to disappoint. The manager repeated his instructions at least twice more, his voice tight. Smile, say yes, and if something goes wrong, it's our fault, never his. Outside, a flash of white light spilled briefly through the frosted front doors, followed by the muffled shouts of photographers calling a name. The hostess straightened reflexively, smoothing the front of her blazer as she hurried to her station, while two busboys abandoned their conversation mid-sentence to peer around a corner. Camilla stacked plates near her assigned station, the porcelain cool against her fingers, pretending not to be curious as the buzz in the room shifted. The Christmas tree near the entrance glowed brighter as the doors opened again, wind tugging at the garlands and sending a faint chill across the front of the restaurant. Somewhere near the bar, a group of businessmen lowered their glasses to watch, their conversation dissolving into impressed murmurs. James Harrington stepped inside like he belonged to the light itself, his navy suit tailored so precisely it seemed to move with a will of its own. A red silk tie echoed the accent plates on every table, as if the whole room had been decorated around him. He shook snow from his hair with a practiced, boyish gesture that made the hostess blush and the manager straighten his tie. Behind him, photographers snapped a few last hopeful shots through the glass before the doors swung shut, cutting off the chaos and leaving only the muted elegance of the interior. James greeted the staff he recognized by name, each smile measured, generous but distant, like a man used to being both adored and slightly feared. To the other guests, he was a living headline seated in their midst on Christmas Eve. At his side walked Olivia, small and rigid in a red dress that matched the ornaments on the tree, a thin black coat still buttoned to her throat. Her headband glinted under the chandelier, but there was nothing playful in the way she held herself. Her jaw was clenched, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the room, as if she were bracing for impact. Earbuds sat unused around her neck, the tablet in her hand dark but clutched like a shield. When the hostess offered to take her coat, Olivia ignored her, fingers tightening instead around the device until her knuckles whitened. Behind them, James's sister Victoria followed, like a shadow wrapped in designer wool, her posture perfect, eyes sweeping the room with cool appraisal that weighed everything and everyone in a single glance. Camilla watched from her station as the Harringtons were guided to her section, each step they took bending the energy of the restaurant around them. The manager shot her one last warning look and then plastered on his best holiday smile, escorting the family to their table beneath the chandelier. Conversations swelled and dipped in their wake, guests pretending not to stare while craning their necks, just enough to see. As James pulled out a chair for Olivia and Victoria adjusted her gloves with delicate precision, Camilla felt a strange chill run through her despite the warmth of the room. There was something brittle beneath all that polish, something tight and sharp in the air around the little girl in red, and as Camilla picked up a water pitcher and headed toward their table, she couldn't shake the quiet, unsettling thought that the real storm of the evening had just walked through the door. Camilla approached the Harrington table with the water pitcher hugged close to her side, the cool metal sweating against her fingers. Up close, the family's perfection looked almost fragile. James's smile a touch too bright, Victoria's posture a shade too straight, Olivia's stillness too tight for a child surrounded by twinkling lights. "Good evening, everyone," Camilla said softly, pouring water into crystal glasses, careful not to spill a single drop. She bent slightly toward Olivia, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "And for you, miss, what would you like to drink tonight? Hot chocolate, apple juice?" For the first time, the girl's eyes twitched toward her, surprised at being addressed first. Before Olivia could form a syllable, Victoria's voice sliced neatly through the moment. "She'll have sparkling water with a slice of lemon. No sugar," the aunt announced, as if reading from a script only she could see. Her gaze flicked over Camilla, quick and cool, landing briefly on the small accent in her English before moving on. "And it's Olivia," she added, over-enunciating each syllable as if correcting a child. "Not Olivia." Heat pricked at the back of Camilla's neck. She hadn't realized the softness of her native language had colored the name. She murmured a polite, "Of course," swallowing the urge to apologize for the tongue that had carried her here. James barely glanced up from his phone, thumb scrolling through a screen full of notifications and holiday greetings. "Sorry about that," he said, his apology drifting somewhere between Camilla and the tablecloth as he tapped out a reply. "It's been a long week." The screen's blue glow reflected in his glass, turning the water a strange, cold color. Beside him, Olivia stared at the untouched breadbasket, her fingers picking at the edge of the napkin instead of reaching for food. Each time the girl shifted, Victoria's hand twitched toward her, ready to correct, to straighten, to hush, but never quite to comfort. It was like watching someone try to hold fog in a fist. Later, when the first course arrived, Camilla set down the plates with practiced care, offering the same gentle smile to each guest. She paused by Olivia and let her gaze drop to the bracelet on the girl's wrist, a delicate band of red thread and tiny beads that looked handmade, out of place among the diamonds and gold at the table. "That's a beautiful bracelet," Camilla said quietly, as if the compliment were meant only for them. "Does it have a story?" For a split second, Olivia's fingers froze over the beads, and her eyes darted up, wide and startled, like someone whose hiding place had been discovered. Something raw flickered there, loss maybe, or memory, before it slammed shut behind a practiced glare. In a single deliberate motion, Olivia jerked her hand away and bumped her glass, sending it tipping onto its side. Sparkling water rushed across the white tablecloth, the lemon slice spinning like a tiny, stranded sun as the liquid spread. The cold wave surged toward Camilla's apron, but she stepped back just in time, watching the stain bloom between the plates like a small, shimmering wound. "Olivia," James hissed under his breath, finally looking up, annoyance tightening his jaw. Victoria sighed dramatically, lifting her napkin as though the spill were a personal insult. "Honestly, darling, this is exactly what I mean when I say she needs specialized care," she murmured, loud enough for Camilla and half the table to hear. The girl stared at the spreading water, her face blank, but in the glossy surface, Camilla caught the reflection of eyes that looked nothing like defiance and everything like fear. The courses flowed out of the kitchen like a parade: soup, salad, gleaming plates of roasted meats and vegetables, each one set before the Harringtons with the care reserved for fragile glass. Camilla watched the table from the corner of her eye as she moved through her other stations, always aware of the way the air seemed to thicken whenever she stepped within arm's reach. Every time she approached, she checked her posture, her smile, even the angle of the plates, remembering the manager's warning beating in time with her heart. Around them, the restaurant buzzed with soft laughter and clinking glasses, but at that one table, conversation moved in short, clipped sentences, like people measuring every word before they dared let it go. Victoria's voice became the quiet metronome of the evening, ticking through criticisms with elegant precision. A fork was placed, a fraction too close to the plate. The soup was 1 degree cooler than ideal. The bread was far too rustic for a holiday like this. Each remark landed with a gentle smile and a razor edge, delivered loudly enough for staff to hear and guests to notice. When a younger waiter refilled James's glass from the left instead of the right, Victoria's eyebrow arched, and she murmured something about training standards that made the boy's ears flush. Camilla felt each correction like a small cut, not because they were hers, but because she could see the way they carved away at the confidence of everyone who came near. James tried to smooth the roughness with practiced charm, raising his glass for casual toasts and thanking the staff by name whenever he remembered it. "To family," he said once, clinking his glass against Victoria's, and then, after a pause, against Olivia's untouched drink. The words hung oddly in the air, too grand for a table where no one quite looked at each other. His phone lay face down beside his plate now, as if he had decided to perform attentiveness, but his gaze still drifted toward it between sentences, habit tightening his features whenever it buzzed. His smile never fully reached his eyes, and when Olivia flinched at a sudden burst of laughter from a neighboring table, he didn't seem to notice at all. Olivia tested the edges of the invisible boundaries laid out around her, as if searching for a way out. She pushed her plate an inch, then another, waiting for the reprimand that inevitably came. She made faces at a boy at a nearby table, earning a quick, amused grin from him before his parents gently turned him back to his dessert. Under the table, her shoe thudded against a chair leg in an irregular rhythm, drawing a warning glance from Victoria and a sigh from James. When Camilla brought a replacement napkin after the earlier spill, she placed it beside the girl's hand with a small, wordless smile, only to watch Victoria slide it away, folding it perfectly, as if even that quiet offer of care were somehow out of line. The longer the night went on, the more Camilla's chest tightened with a quiet, simmering anger she did not dare show. She had grown up in houses where tempers flared and cooled like summer storms, but this was different. This was a storm no one acknowledged, a constant pressure that left everyone walking on tiptoe. It hurt to see Olivia treated less like a grieving child and more like a problem to be managed, a reputation to be contained. As Camilla cleared another course, she caught the girl's eyes for a fleeting second and saw a plea there she could not yet answer. The candles had burned lower, the shadows on the walls growing longer, and as the main course prepared to leave the kitchen, a simple, heavy certainty settled over Camilla's heart. This delicate balance could not hold much longer, and when it finally broke, everyone would be watching to see who they chose to blame. By the time the main course left the kitchen, the room felt heavier, as if the chandelier itself were sinking under the weight of unspoken words. Camilla carried the tray toward the Harrington table, the scent of roasted meat and herbs curling up around her like steam from a boiling pot. Olivia's plate was cleared of everything but the fork she kept twisting in her hand, digging faint tracks into the porcelain. James's smile had grown thinner, his patience stretched as tight as his tie, while Victoria's eyes glittered with the satisfaction of someone waiting to be proven right. Camilla set the plates down with care, but the moment the food touched the table, she could feel something in the air finally snap. "I don't want it," Olivia said, her voice low at first, almost reasonable, as she stared at the carefully arranged food. No one answered. James lifted his glass instead, ready to offer another meaningless toast, while Victoria dabbed at the corner of her mouth with her napkin, already moving on. "I said I don't want it," Olivia repeated, louder this time, and when the silence continued, she shoved the plate away so hard it skidded to the edge of the table. The silverware clattered, a knife tipping and falling to the floor with a sharp, accusing ring. Heads turned, conversations broke off mid-laugh, leaving the girl's ragged breathing exposed in the center of the room. In one swift movement, Olivia climbed onto her chair, the heels of her shoes scraping the cushion as she stood above the table like a tiny, furious storm. "This is the worst Christmas ever," she shouted, the words cracking on the last syllable. "Mom wouldn't make me eat here with strangers. She wouldn't make me pretend." Her fists clenched at her sides, eyes blazing with a fury that was only barely hiding the devastation underneath. Around her, faces shifted, some annoyed, some pitying, some eager for the spectacle they'd later described to friends. The manager started toward them, his expression already folding into apology before he'd even reached the table. "Olivia, get down!" James hissed, his jaw tight, the public mask sliding off to reveal a man who could close billion-dollar deals but could not reach his own child. Victoria rose halfway from her seat, fingers biting into the back of the girl's chair, voice sharp and controlled. "This is exactly why she needs professional supervision," she said to James, as if Olivia weren't standing right there. "These episodes aren't normal, and this," she flicked a glance at Camilla, "is what happens when staff don't know how to handle her." The manager nodded weakly, already turning his sternness toward Camilla, as if scolding her might settle the storm. Blame, like heat, began to gather in her direction. The plate wobbled at the edge of the table, Olivia's foot nudging it dangerously close to the drop, the meal teetering between order and chaos. Something in Camilla couldn't bear it. The way the girl's panic was being misread as mischief, the way everyone seemed more afraid of a mess on the floor than a broken heart on the chair. Before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped forward, cutting through the circle of tension, placing herself squarely between the child and the adults. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she lifted her hand, palm open, the same way she had once tried to calm her little cousins back home when their world felt too big. When she spoke, her voice shook only on the first word. "Enough," she said softly, then stronger. "Not tonight. Not on Christmas." For a moment time folded. The restaurant froze in a tableau of shock. James, with his glass half raised, Victoria halfway out of her chair, Olivia trembling on the cushion with her mouth still open on an unsaid scream. Camilla felt the weight of every gaze pressing against her back, the future tipping like that plate at the edge of the table. Olivia's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her as someone finally stood with her instead of against her, and she sank slowly back down into her seat, eyes never leaving Camilla's face. The manager reached them at last, his voice tight as he whispered, "We'll speak about this later," but James's voice cut over his, low and dangerous. "No," he said, staring at Camilla as if she were a puzzle he'd never intended to solve. "We'll talk now, outside." And as she followed the manager toward the swinging door, the sound of her own footsteps felt like the closing of a chapter she hadn't meant to end. The staff corridor swallowed the music and chatter in a single heavy gulp as the swinging door thudded shut behind Camilla. Back here the world shrank to fluorescent lights, scuffed tiles, and the faint hiss of the dishwashers working overtime. The warmth of the dining room gave way to a damp chill that sank through her thin shirt, making her shiver as adrenaline began to ebb. The manager walked ahead of her in brisk, clipped steps, the festive Santa tie at his throat looking strangely out of place above his clenched jaw. When he pushed open the door to the staff room, it banged softly against the wall, as if even the building were tired of tonight. The staff room was a shoebox, lined with dented lockers and a small metal table ringed by mismatched chairs, the air thick with the smell of old coffee and fryer grease clinging to coats. "Sit," the manager said, without looking at her, rubbing his forehead with the heel of his hand. Camilla lowered herself onto a chair that wobbled on one uneven leg, her apron twisted in her fingers like a rope. Voices floated in faintly from the kitchen, orders shouted, timers chiming, but in here everything felt muffled, like she was underwater. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a steady knocking that matched the thought repeating in her mind. "I shouldn't have done that. I had to do that. I shouldn't have done that." The manager paced a short path between the lockers and the door, his shoes squeaking a little on the tiles. "Do you have any idea who that man is?" he asked finally, his voice low but sharp. He didn't wait for an answer. "This restaurant stays open in January because we don't lose clients like James Harrington. And tonight, in the middle of his family dinner, my waitress decides to give a speech." He huffed out a humorless laugh, hands spreading in helpless disbelief. "If he pulls his events, the owner will have my head, and yours won't even be a question." Each word landed like another stone on her chest, stacking neatly on top of rent, tuition, and the Christmas gift she'd already mailed home. "I'm sorry," Camilla said. And she meant it. For the trouble, for the risk, for the way the night had bent around her small act of defiance. But she was scared. Everyone kept talking over her, like she wasn't even there. Her voice thinned, but she forced herself to keep going. "I just wanted her to stop looking at that plate like it was the enemy." The manager looked at her then, really looked, the anger in his eyes softening just enough to reveal the exhaustion underneath. For a brief, flickering moment, it seemed he understood exactly what she meant, and just as quickly, the understanding shuttered behind work-worn caution. He sighed, shoulders slumping as if he'd aged 5 years since the shift began. "Finish your tables," he said, his tone resigned rather than cruel. "Stay out of their way. After the holidays, we'll review your schedule." The words tasted like goodbye even before he left the room, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft, final click. Alone, Camilla rested her forehead against the cool metal of the locker, the hum of the fluorescent light filling the silence where her plans used to be. In the flicker of that harsh white glow, she saw again Olivia's face as the shouting stopped, confused, trembling, almost relieved, and wondered if protecting a stranger's child at a stranger's table was worth the job she could not afford to lose, even as some quiet part of her whispered that, for the first time in a long time, she had done something her mother might be proud of. The rest of the night blurred into a series of motions that felt distant, as if Camilla were watching someone else move through her body. She left the staff room when the timer over the kitchen pass shrieked, tying her apron back in place with fingers that still trembled. No one mentioned what had happened at the Harrington table. The other servers only glanced at her quickly, sympathy and caution tangled in their airs. She finished refilling glasses, delivered desserts to people whose biggest worry was whether the whipped cream would melt too fast, and avoided the far corner where the chandelier glowed brightest. Each step she took felt careful, measured, as though the floor might crack if she pressed too hard. By the time the clock above the dish pit crept toward the end of her shift, the restaurant had settled into a softer hum. Children slept against their parents' shoulders, red napkins forgotten on laps, while couples lingered over coffee and warm brandy. Camilla retreated to the back hallway with a tub of silverware, sinking onto an overturned crate, grateful for the relative quiet. The corridor buzzed faintly with the sound of the industrial fridge and the clatter of dishes being stacked. But here, away from the lights, she could finally breathe without feeling watched. Her fingers moved on automatic rolling knife, fork, spoon into cloth, tying each with a thin gold ribbon the manager insisted on for holidays. She told herself that if she made it to the bottom of the tub, she would let that be enough for tonight. She was halfway through a roll when the subtle scrape of shoes on tile made her look up. There, in the doorway where the warm dining room light faded into the cooler glow of the hallway, stood Olivia, small, coat half-buttoned, tablet tucked under one arm like a forgotten shield. Her eyes were swollen from crying, lashes clumped together, the red bow in her hair now lopsided and slipping. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The clink of plates and the murmur of distant voices carried on without noticing that the center of the night had quietly shifted. Camilla's first thought was that someone must be right behind the girl, but when she leaned slightly to see past her, the space beyond was empty. "You're not supposed to be back here," Camilla said gently, though there was no edge to the words, only worry. Olivia took a tentative step into the corridor, the restaurant noise dimming behind her like a door slowly closing. "They're busy," the girl whispered, tugging at her sleeve with restless fingers. "They don't know I left." Her English, usually sharp when she shouted, sounded smaller now, each syllable hovering in the cool air between them. She studied Camilla with a seriousness that seemed too old for her age, as if trying to decide whether this was someone safe, someone real, or just another adult who would tell her to be quiet and go sit down. "Why weren't you scared?" Olivia asked suddenly, the question bursting out before she could stop it. "When you said no. When you told me to stop." She hugged the tablet closer to her chest, as if bracing for the answer. Camilla set down the half-rolled silverware and folded her hands in her lap, its thin gold ribbon dangling over her knuckles. "I was scared," she said softly, honesty settling between them like a shared blanket. "But I was more scared of watching you feel alone in a room full of people who pretended not to see you." Olivia's mouth trembled, the words striking some tender place she had worked hard to hide. As she edged closer, the hallway light caught the little red bracelet on her wrist, and for the first time that night, Camilla saw not a spoiled heiress, but a child looking for someone willing to stand in the space between chaos and comfort. For a moment, the hallway became its own small world, fluorescent light above, shadows stretching long on the tiled floor, two hearts learning how to share silence. Olivia sank onto the crate opposite Camilla, tablet abandoned at her side, legs swinging just above the ground. "Everyone gets mad when I'm loud," she said, staring at the ribbon on her wrist, "but nobody listens when I'm not." Camilla nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in her chest like a familiar ache. "Sometimes," she replied, "being loud is the only way to prove you're still there." The girl's mouth twitched, caught between a frown and something almost like a smile. Camilla began to talk, not about the restaurant or the money she owed, but about the little house she'd left behind, where Christmas meant plastic tablecloths and too many cousins squeezed around a borrowed table. She told Olivia about her first day working here, when she'd dropped an entire tray of desserts and wanted to disappear into the floor. "I thought they were going to fire me before I even got my uniform," she said, rolling another fork into a napkin. "Instead, the chef just handed me a mop and said, 'We all break something when we're learning.'" A small, surprised giggle escaped Olivia at the picture of Camilla surrounded by fallen cakes, and the sound was so soft and pure it made Camilla's throat tighten. "I don't break stuff because I'm learning," Olivia muttered after a beat, eyes dropping to her shoes. "I break stuff because it feels like everything is already broken and nobody cares." And the confession drifted into the cool air, fragile as spun sugar. Camilla leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees, her voice gentle. "Maybe they don't know how to care the right way," she said. "Grown-ups get scared too. They just hide it behind rules and big words." Olivia studied her, measuring the answer like a secret she might choose to keep. "Mom never hid," she whispered. "She just left." The ache in that sentence was so clear that Camilla didn't reach for a clever reply. She simply nodded, letting the pain have room instead of shoving it away. Footsteps echoed at the far end of the corridor, sharp, expensive, unmistakable. Camilla straightened instinctively, wiping her hands on her apron, while Olivia flinched and gripped the edge of the crate. James appeared first, framed in the doorway, his tie slightly askew now, hair no longer ready for the camera. For an instant, anger surged in his eyes at the sight of his daughter far from the table with a member of the staff. His mouth opened, ready to scold, but then he heard it. The faint echo of his child's recent laughter still clinging to the air like the last note of a song. Whatever words he'd planned to unleash stalled on his tongue. Victoria's heels clicked up behind him, irritation already sharpened to a point, but James lifted a hand without looking at her, his gaze fixed on Olivia. The girl shrank in on herself, clearly expecting punishment, yet her arm was pressed so tightly against Camilla's that it was obvious she'd chosen her side. "Dad," she said, small but steady, "I just needed a minute." James looked from his daughter to the waitress, who had nearly cost herself a job to stand between them, and saw, for the first time that night, not defiance, but a kind of courage he'd forgotten existed. "Miss," he said, his voice quieter than before, "would you come back to the table with us, as a sort of holiday helper for Olivia?" And as they walked back into the golden glow of the dining room, Olivia's hand wrapped around Camilla's fingers, passing beneath the chandelier, like they were stepping into a scene they had finally chosen for themselves, not one scripted by wealth or fear. Back in the dining room, the atmosphere shifted just enough for Camilla to feel it, like a window cracked open in a stuffy room. Olivia slid into her chair without protest, fingers still wrapped around Camilla's hand until the very last second. James moved a little slower now, his eyes lingering on his daughter instead of his phone, as if memorizing the way she breathed between bouts of tension. Victoria, however, watched the reunion with tight-lipped disapproval, her napkin folded with surgical precision on her lap. Dessert menus appeared, delicate cards laid out like invitations to joy, but a thread of unease still wound itself around the base of the chandelier and through Camilla's ribs. Camilla stayed close, refilling glasses, trading quiet words with Olivia that never quite grew loud enough for the others to hear. She suggested small choices. Do you want the chocolate cake or the ice cream? Turning potential battles into gentle negotiations the girl could win. Each time Olivia answered without shouting, Camilla felt a tiny, invisible victory settle between them like a star no one else could see. Guests at nearby tables relaxed, sensing that the storm had, at least for the moment, passed over without breaking everything. The manager hovered at a safe distance, expression wary, but grudgingly impressed by how calm the problem child looked now. During a lull between courses, Camilla slipped into the service corridor to catch her breath, leaning briefly against the cool wall. The hallway hummed with the familiar background music of the restaurant's machinery, dishwashers churning, the low rumble of the fridge, the muffled clatter of pans. She reached for a tray of clean plates, ready to return to the floor, when a soft voice drifted around the corner from the slightly open door of the side office. It was clipped and controlled, each word carefully measured. "Yes, the papers are ready," Victoria was saying, her tone far colder than the one she used for toasts. "Once James signs, guardianship is effectively mine. The boarding school is the perfect pretext." Camilla froze, fingers tightening around the edge of the tray until her knuckles whitened. She didn't mean to listen, but the words rolled toward her like a slow-breaking wave she couldn't outrun. "The trust will be easier to manage when Olivia is officially labeled as unstable," Victoria continued, the faint rustle of documents punctuating her calm cruelty. "He's exhausted. Grief makes people compliant. One more public episode like tonight, and he'll agree that she needs professional care away from all this." There was a pause, then a low, humorless laugh. "A troubled child makes justification very simple, especially when the numbers have this many zeros." The numbers, the trust, the boarding school. Camilla's stomach turned as the scattered pieces she'd witnessed all evening began to click into a bitter, chilling picture. A floorboard creaked softly under Camilla's foot, the sound barely more than a sigh, but enough to break the spell. The office door eased open another inch, and Victoria's silhouette appeared in the gap, phone still held loosely to her ear. Her gaze slid down the hallway and landed on Camilla, pinning her in place with a look that held no surprise, only calculation. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The fluorescent light above them buzzed like an insect trapped in glass. Then Victoria's lips curved into a small, warning smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile that said she knew exactly how much a poor waitress could lose by opening her mouth. "I'll call you back," she murmured into the phone, never breaking eye contact, and ended the call with a quiet click. The silence that followed pressed in on Camilla as hard as any shouted threat. Her mind raced ahead to all the possibilities. Going to James and being dismissed as a dramatic employee, saying nothing, and watching Olivia disappear into some distant special school, trying to confront Victoria and being crushed under the weight of her money and influence. Her palms were slick against the tray, the edges digging into her skin like a choice she didn't know how to make. "You should be careful where you stand, dear," Victoria said softly as she stepped fully into the hall, voice wrapped in sugar and steel. Sometimes people overhear things they don't understand. Camilla stood rooted to the spot, heart hammering, knowing that whatever she chose to do with what she'd heard would change not only Olivia's life, but the fragile, flickering future she'd been fighting so hard to build for herself. When Camilla stepped back into the dining room, the warmth hit her like a wave, but it didn't reach the knot in her stomach. She moved on autopilot toward the Harrington table, the knowledge of what she'd heard clanging around her mind, louder than the clink of cutlery. Dessert had arrived, delicate slices of cake, ice cream in crystal bowls, sparklers flickering like tiny stars. Guests at nearby tables lifted their phones, eager to capture the billionaire's perfect Christmas moment. At the center of it all, Olivia sat stiff and small, spoon untouched, eyes darting nervously between her father and her aunt. Victoria was already talking, her voice smooth as cream, her words anything but. "We should be grateful the school is willing to take her so soon," she said, laying a hand on James's arm in a gesture that looked caring to anyone who didn't know better. "They're experts with children like Olivia. Imagine how much calmer next Christmas could be, for everyone." James stared at his dessert, jaw working, exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. "Maybe," he murmured, not quite agreeing, not quite refusing, just floating in the numb space where decisions are made for people too tired to fight. The sparkler in Olivia's dish hissed out, leaving a thin trail of smoke curling upward. "I don't want to go," Olivia blurted, the words tumbling out too fast to stop. Her chair scraped as she twisted toward her father, panic rising in her voice. "I'll be good, I promise. I'll try harder. I'll stop breaking things. Just don't send me away." Her fingers reached blindly under the table, searching for Camilla's sleeve like a lifeline, finding it and holding on tight. The noise of the restaurant faded again, as if someone had turned down the volume on the whole world. James opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Liv," he said, the nickname small and unfamiliar on his tongue. "We're just trying to do what's best." Camilla felt the words she'd overheard pressing against her ribs, demanding to be let out. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, each pulse whispering all the reasons she should stay silent. Her job, her rent, her mother's faith in her. But Olivia's grip on her sleeve shook with a terror that had nothing to do with spilled water or broken plates. "Sometimes," Camilla said quietly, her voice threading into the conversation like a careful stitch, "what's easiest for adults isn't what's best for a child." Victoria's head snapped toward her, eyes narrowing. "This is a private family matter," she said, her tone like ice breaking. "You've already overstepped once tonight." No one moved. No one spoke. James looked between the two women, the polished aunt and the tired waitress, caught between the world he'd built and the truth he didn't want to see. The room held its breath, waiting to see who he would allow to finish the story. "Mr. Harrington," Camilla continued before fear could drag her back, "if you're going to make a decision about your daughter's future tonight, you should hear all of it." "Bye." The words hung in the air like a question and a challenge at once, and as James slowly pushed his chair back from the table, the legs scraping against the floor, it was clear that this Christmas dinner was no longer just a performance. It had become a reckoning. James stood slowly, the legs of his chair scraping against the polished floor, drawing every wandering gaze back to the Harrington table. For a moment, he didn't look at Camilla or Victoria. He looked at Olivia, small and trembling, her fingers still locked around the red bracelet and the edge of Camilla's sleeve. "Liv," he said, more softly this time, "tell me what you're afraid of." The room shrank around them, the buzz of other conversations fading to a distant hum. Olivia swallowed hard, eyes glistening, and opened her mouth as if stepping to the edge of a cliff. "I'm afraid you're going to send me away," she whispered, then louder, "and that you won't come back for me." Her words cracked something open in the air, like glass, finally admitting it was broken. "Since Mom died, everyone talks about me like I'm a problem," she continued, the dam fully breaking now. "They say I'm too loud, too much, too angry. Aunt Victoria says you're tired of me. She says you can't handle me alone." Her voice wobbled over the last words, but she held his gaze with desperate determination. "I'm not crazy, Dad. I'm just sad. And nobody lets me be sad." Tears spilled over, sliding down her cheeks and onto the pristine tablecloth, more honest than anything that had been placed on the table all night. Victoria's composure tightened, lips pressing into a thin line. "James, this is exactly what I'm talking about," she said crisply, turning the moment into evidence. "She's emotionally unstable. She needs professionals, not late-night heart-to-hearts with waitstaff." The word waitstaff landed like an insult, echoing louder than she intended. Camilla felt the slight like a physical shove, but stayed where she was, rooted beside Olivia's chair. Her heart pounded against her ribs, each beat urging her to stay silent, to protect herself. But she had already stepped too far into the circle of their lives to pretend she hadn't heard what she had heard. "Mr. Harrington," Camilla said, her voice trembling at first, then finding steadier ground, "I didn't mean to overhear anything tonight, but I did." James turned toward her slowly, something wary and raw in his eyes. "Your sister talked in the back office about guardianship papers, about using Olivia's episodes as proof she should be sent away, about the trust." The word felt heavy on her tongue, foreign and expensive. "She said the school was a perfect pretext, that grief makes people compliant." The last phrase she repeated almost exactly, because it had carved itself into her memory the moment she'd heard it. Silence fell again, thicker now, but this time it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence before a verdict. "That is a vicious lie," Victoria snapped, rising to her feet, her chair knocking lightly against the floor. "You misunderstand business conversations you were never meant to hear. James, you cannot seriously be considering the word of a—" She cut herself off, but the contempt she'd almost named hung in the air anyway. James didn't look at her. He stared at the table, at his daughter's shaking shoulders, at Camilla's pale knuckles where Olivia clung to her. Memories flickered behind his eyes, missed school plays, cancelled weekends, long hours spent building an empire that could not tuck a child into bed. When he finally lifted his head, there was a clarity in his gaze that hadn't been there all evening. "I need the manager," he said quietly, each word deliberate. "And the keys to the office, right now." And as the staff hurried to obey, the entire restaurant understood that the narrative of the Harrington family had just slipped out of polished, familiar hands and landed squarely in the fragile, honest grip of a grieving father who had finally, painfully, started to wake up. The manager appeared at James's side, with the office keys trembling on a small brass ring, his eyes wide with a mixture of dread and curiosity. "Of course, Mr. Harrington," he murmured, glancing quickly at Camilla as if trying to understand how a waitress had become central to this unfolding drama. James took the keys without a word and turned to Victoria, his gaze steady in a way that made her straighten as if facing a boardroom instead of a dessert table. "We're going to clear this up," he said quietly. "Tonight." The restaurant watched him weave between tables toward the back hallway, Victoria following in his wake like a shadow suddenly unsure of its shape. The office was small and cluttered, a world away from the shining marble outside, file cabinets breathing dust, a computer humming on an overburdened desk, printouts pinned to a corkboard with crooked thumbtacks. James closed the door behind them, the latch clicking with more finality than any boardroom vote. He asked the manager for the call log, for a quiet place to make a private call, for his lawyer's number from his contacts. Victoria tried to protest, her voice low and urgent, insisting that this was unnecessary drama in front of strangers, that the girl in the apron had misunderstood everything. But as James repeated the phrases Camilla had relayed, guardianship transfer, unstable child, perfect pretext, the colour drained from Victoria's face just enough to betray her. The lawyer's voice crackled through the speakerphone, calm and measured even at the late hour. Yes, papers had been drafted. Yes, there were provisions that shifted significant financial control for the sake of stability. No, James had not been fully briefed. The documents were scheduled for his signature after the holidays, under the guise of streamlining responsibilities during a difficult emotional period. Each confirmation landed like a weight on the desk between them. Victoria tried to spin it, to frame herself as a worried aunt, protecting both brother and niece from spiraling chaos. But her words tangled in the details she had not expected to be repeated back to her in front of counsel. When the call ended, the room seemed suddenly very still. James leaned back against the edge of the desk, hands braced on either side, as if he feared his legs might not hold him. "You were going to take my daughter," he said quietly, the hurt in his voice deeper than the anger. "Not just for a term at some school. You were planning a life for her that didn't include me." Victoria flinched, eyes glistening with something that looked uncomfortably like genuine pain. "You weren't there, James," she shot back, her composure cracking. "Someone had to be. You lost your wife and buried yourself in work. I was trying to secure her future before your guilt drove you to sign anything just to feel better." There was truth in her words, but it was twisted around a greed she hadn't bothered to hide. "I won't sign," James said at last, his voice firm in a way it hadn't been all evening. "Not now. Not without a therapist who actually knows my daughter, not without full transparency, and not if it means labeling her as broken, so it's easier to move money around." He handed the keys back to the manager with a nod that held both apology and authority. "Please have any documents sent to my office. There will be no guardianship changes this month." Then he turned to Victoria, the muscles in his jaw tight, but his tone measured. "Go home tonight. We'll talk later. But whatever we were, whatever we are, you don't get to decide her future in the shadows." As he stepped back into the warm glow of the dining room alone, the weight of the choice settled over him like a heavy coat, and for the first time all evening, he seemed willing to carry it. When James returned to the table, Olivia's eyes flew to his, searching for a verdict written in the lines of his face. He eased into the seat beside her instead of across, the simple shift feeling monumental in its intimacy. "You're not going to that school," he said gently, so only she and Camilla could hear. "Not as a punishment, not as an excuse." Tears sprang to Olivia's eyes again, but this time they mixed with something lighter, shakier. Hope. She leaned sideways until her shoulder pressed against his arm, the contact tentative but real. James looked up at Camilla then, the gratitude in his gaze uncluttered by pride. "Thank you," he said out loud, in front of everyone who had watched this night unravel, "for seeing her, for saying what I should have said a long time ago." Then, almost as an afterthought and yet not at all, he added, "and for risking more than I had any right to ask." Snow drifted lazily through the December sky, settling on the sidewalks like soft memory as Camilla stepped down from the bus. Her new coat held the cold at bay, a quiet luxury she still wasn't used to, while her boots left firm, confident prints in the slush. At her side, her mother clung to her arm, eyes shining as she took in the glow of shop windows and garlands wrapped around lampposts. "So this is where you spent your Christmas," she murmured, half in wonder, half in disbelief. For the first time, Camilla could answer with a smile that didn't hide any part of the truth. The restaurant rose ahead of them, its windows steamed with warmth, the familiar chandelier blazing like a star over the entrance. A year ago, she had slipped through the staff door, heart pounding, hoping for tips and mercy. Tonight she walked through the front, a guest whose name was on the reservation list. Inside, the air smelled of cinnamon and roasted meat, but it no longer carried the weight of dread in her chest. The maitre d' greeted her with respect, not urgency, and welcomed her mother as if she were royalty. "Mr. Harrington is delighted you could join him," he said, and the words settled over her like a blessing. They had barely reached their table by the tree when a blur of green and laughter barreled toward them. Olivia wrapped her arms around Camilla's waist, almost knocking her back a step, her hair ribboned but loose, her eyes brighter and steadier than before. "You made it," she exclaimed, then turned eagerly to Camilla's mother to introduce herself, stumbling over formal phrases she'd clearly practiced. On the table nearby lay a worn sketchbook, pages filled with drawings and short letters from other children who had lost someone, all part of the foundation she and James now quietly nurtured. Across the cover, in careful block letters, someone had written, "Hearts that don't fit quietly." James approached at a slower pace, but his smile reached all the way to his eyes this year. He shook Camilla's mother's hand with both of his, thanking her for raising the bravest person I've ever hired, and then had the good sense to lose to a better future. There was still tiredness in his face, and grief hadn't magically vanished, but it now shared space with something softer, resolve, humility, and a father's hard-won tenderness. In the corner, Victoria sat at a smaller table, speaking quietly with a therapist who had become a regular presence in their lives, her posture less rigid, her gaze less sharp. The old power games had loosened, not perfect, not simple, but moving at last, in a kinder direction. Later, as dessert arrived, this time chosen by Olivia without anyone speaking over her, Camilla let her thoughts drift back to the girl on the chair a year ago, to the raised hand and the words that had changed everything. She understood now that the miracle had not been the envelope or the scholarship, though they had opened doors. It had been the decision to say no in a room full of people afraid of the truth. That single, trembling moment had rippled outward into therapy sessions, cancelled legal transfers, new programs for hurting children, and a mother flown in to see it all with her own eyes. Standing by the Christmas tree with James and Olivia, bathed in gentle light instead of harsh expectation, Camilla felt a quiet certainty unfurl in her chest. Somewhere, right now, another heart is waiting for someone brave enough to stand up and say, "Enough," with love. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.